Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And today we're going to talk about mineral rights and energy news for July of 2024. Justin, we have some really interesting stories this month with respect to some endangered species decisions that could have a significant impact on the Permian Basin, which is probably the biggest story this month, but also some really interesting statistics around oil production and an unexpected place where we could see a big lithium boom that I think a lot of our listeners may have minerals and royalties. So this is something you should definitely be aware of. And then, of course, we're going to wrap up with the rig count. But yeah, what did you think about this month's stories, Justin?
Yeah, it kind of covers the gamut, man, from kind of changing the political narrative on oil and gas production. We're doing a lot of talking about lithium. Something in our recent convention, Matt, is we talked about using geothermal energy to produce, or geothermal to produce energy. And it's interesting to kind of see the merge of the technologies of oil and gas and the political division between stopping oil and gas production, but also ramping up production, maybe using the same technologies for other minerals.
Yeah, that's a great point. And what Justin was referring to when he mentioned the recent convention, that was the National Association of Royalty Owners Rocky Mountain chapter recently had their annual convention in Denver, which was an online webcast as well as in person. If you are not a member of NARO, the National Association of Royalty Owners, definitely check it out. We'll put a link in the show notes to the website, or you can just go to join-naro.org. Again, that's join-naro.org. And there's a lot more information about the membership options. And one of the main benefits of being a member of NARO is you get access to exclusive education events that they offer both in person and then through webinars. And in fact, we have a national convention coming up in Houston in October. So be sure to check that out. If you're not already a member, Justin and I are both members, have been for a number of years, and both serve on various capacities on state and national boards, volunteering our time for NARO. So it's a great organization. Check it out. And that, like Justin said, that's, one of the things that was discussed. One of the speakers was talking about geothermal. And so that's a really big opportunity, especially in parts of the West where we have, that as a economic option. And that's something that's really being looked at, of course, with the focus on decarbonizing our energy systems, which kind of brings us to this first story, Justin, around this new endangered listing for a rare lizard that really could impact oil and gas. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, man. And it's in some of the top producing lands in the United States. So the article says federal wildlife officials declared a rare lizard in southeastern New Mexico and West Texas an endangered species Friday, citing future energy development, sand mining, and climate change as the biggest threats to its survival in one of the world's most lucrative oil and natural gas basins. And Matt, this is politically definitely causing some strife on either side. The Permian Basin Petroleum Association, the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association expressed disappointment, saying the determination flies in the face of available science and ignores long-standing state-sponsored conservation efforts across hundreds and thousands of acres and commitment of millions of dollars in both states. And Matt, obviously, if they do this, it's really endangering the ability to develop new lands where this lizard may inhabit. And though I'm sure the impact's not fully known yet, there's a lot of fear on both sides, both for the species and for continued oil and gas development on what this might mean. Obviously, on the one side, they're saying that the administration really isn't saving lizards. They're using this as a mechanism to shut down oil and gas production. And of course, the other side is saying that they're trying to rescue an endangered species.
Yeah. And, you read headlines, it's hard to know who to believe. And really, it's interesting to dig into the backstory, because this is something that's been brewing for a number of years. When the Fish and Wildlife Services were putting this Dunes sagebrush lizard on the list of candidate species for listing under the Endangered Species Act. When that happened, there is a process with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service they have this candidate conservation agreement. So it's a proactive conservation effort for those species that in some cases says will eliminate the need to list them under the Endangered Species Act. And so oil and gas companies were pursuing that. And with state regulators, they had some of those candidate conservation agreements in place for this particular lizard to try to protect the habitat and all the things. And despite that, the Fish and Wildlife Services concluded that they needed to put it on the Endangered Species Act, which then triggers a whole set of regulatory hurdles that must be gone through before any oil and gas development can occur. And so it could block oil and gas development in some cases. So I think what you would see happen, and I've seen this in projects when I was working in the industry, doing projects in California, you have to have a biologist come out and do a survey and make sure that there are none of those endangered species that are going to be impacted in the area that you're going to be disturbing the land. Of course, the benefit of horizontal drilling is that you can drill 2 to 3 miles underground. So if you have a habitat of this particular lizard, potentially they could move the surface location over and still access the minerals under the ground. So that is something that I'm sure will be looked at for any areas that are impacted by this particular decision that may need to be moving well site locations. I don't know if it's going to have an impact of blocking any development. We'll have to see. I think that would be something to monitor and to see, our oil and gas companies coming back and publicly stating, hey, we tried to go and develop this project, but we couldn't because of this ruling. Then you'll see probably some lawsuits pop up and things like that. But to your point, Justin, it's somewhat politically motivated. You have both sides sort of towing the party line. On the one hand, the Permian Basin Petroleum Association saying the listing will bring no additional benefit for the species and its habitat, yet could be detrimental to those living and working in the region. And then the other side, obviously, the environmental groups were applauding this decision and saying this is long overdue kind of a thing. Interestingly, the Railroad Commission, one of the commissioners, spoke out against this, Wayne Christensen, who is a conservative, so not surprising kind of language he's using, but he does have a good point, I think, around maybe not so much having to do with saving the lizards, but more around trying to reduce or shut down oil and gas production. So there could be an element of that for sure. And so it'd be interesting to see how Texas responds to this. So I subscribe to a newsletter by a group called Doomberg, and it's basically digs into energy and heavy industry and all things related to that. I saw an interesting newsletter, and it brings up a good point that, Texas is sort of looking at this, and there's some legislation that was passed recently in Texas that actually says that basically no regulators are allowed to follow federal rules that would block economic development in the state of Texas or something to that effect. And so it'd be interesting to see if Texas just says, yeah, nice try, we're going to do whatever we want. So it'd be really interesting to see how this might develop over the next several months or next year around oil and gas development, and whether Texas is actually going to follow the requirements of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the federal agencies, or if they're going to ignore them. So an interesting fight brewing in Texas here.
You said it, Matt. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out. So our next story here is about oil production, as you mentioned at the beginning. So the article title is U.S. to set new oil production record, but 2025 looks bleak. So the article goes on to say U.S. oil production has been flat for the past 10 months, but is still on track to set a new annual record in 2024. Rystad Energy predicts near zero global oil supply growth this year, making it the first time since 2020. Despite flat growth, the U.S. will set a new oil production record in 2024 due to higher than average daily production compared to 2023. And so, Matt, it seems like we kind of hear rattling of this almost every year to some degree, but it is interesting to see that they're predicting flat growth in there.
Yeah, really interesting that it sort of seems contradictory that we are going to set a new annual record in 2024, but we will have flat growth. And the reason for that is we saw U.S. oil production peak at the end of 2023 at around 13.3 million barrels per day. It sort of plateaued off and actually started to fall since then. So our average year to date is around 13.1 million barrels per day, which is higher than last year. And so that's why they're saying that we are going to set a new annual record, because we started off the year at a higher rate than we were in 2020, despite the fact that production is falling, or at least flat. And so, 2024, we may see a new annual record, but if this trend continues, we'll see a drop in 2025. And then, interestingly, if we have the supply growth globally flat, and so basically it's not just the US where this is occurring, but globally. And I think part of this is because of the OPEC decision recently to continue to cut production or hold production at where it's at. And if the global economy and demand continues to grow, it'll be interesting to see what prices do next year. I've seen conflicting reports on what the expected oil prices are going to be in 2025. I think one of the more bearish reports I saw expected that we would see prices fall, which this sort of flies in the face of that, Justin, I think, because if you have production set to be flat globally, but then, we see demand going up every year, in my mind, there's going to be higher demand than there is supply, which means it'll be upward pressure on prices. So you'd see higher oil prices. So I would tend to think that would probably be the case more so than the report that I saw that it was expecting prices to fall back down to the $60 range, which I have a hard time believing unless there's some economic decline that occurs globally.
You said it, Matt. And, I think you kind of have to take it at face value here because this Rystad Energy report is just one opinion in this. The IEA will come out with their own opinion on this and many others that are looking at industry data to kind of make some forecasting assumptions. But it can be just that. It's assumptions. Really can depend, like you said, on the economy, can depend on geopolitical issues. So we shall see.
Absolutely.
All right, Matt. So this next one is really interesting. I'm excited that we're seeing more lithium stories because this is something that isn't just being talked about. It's showing that there's continuous development and lots of research into this as we kind of peek our head into what could be possible. So the article here is researchers in Pittsburgh discover a large source of lithium in Pennsylvania. So researchers have found a gold mine of lithium in Pennsylvania. Discovery suggests that up to 40% of the lithium used in the United States could come from the wastewater from the Marcellus Shale gas wells in the Keystone State. There's a quote here from Justin Mackey, a scientist with the National Energy Technology Laboratory, and that is that this is lithium concentrations that already exist at the surface in some capacity in Pennsylvania. And we found that there was a sufficient lithium in the waters to supply somewhere between 30 and 40% of the current U.S. national demand. Matt, that's big news. They're finding that this can be produced from the wastewater. And like we talked about with some of those exploratory wells, there's a lot of infrastructure that goes into processing this lithium. So once a discovery like this is made, there's a whole technology side that really has to be hammered out on how we do this cost effectively.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the fact that this lithium is there, maybe they're not capitalizing on it right now, but I would expect that to change fairly quickly. As that wastewater stream, instead of injecting that down hole, I would expect them to remove the lithium and get the value out of the lithium and then, inject the wastewater, the produced water into those wastewater injection wells to basically store that underground in those saltwater formations. The article does mention that Justin Mackey had been working on this study for years. He and his mentor, Daniel Bain, associate professor at Pitt's Geology and Environmental Sciences Department, they analyzed Pennsylvania DEP compliance data. So basically the water analysis from the operators, and they looked at what the lithium concentrations were and so forth, and they published their findings in Scientific Reports, which is a journal. Don't know if that's peer-reviewed, how robust the study is, but it sounds like there's some data there that would indicate that there might be economic benefit from doing something with that lithium. And so if you have minerals and royalties, I think the takeaway from this is if you have minerals and royalties in Pennsylvania, is to make sure that you're getting paid for that lithium if they are indeed extracting it and selling it and getting the value out of that particular mineral. I'm not sure what the laws are in Pennsylvania around the treatment of produced water. I know in Texas, the custody of that goes to the operator because it's considered a waste stream. And so it was intended that the operator would be held liable for that. But then on the other hand, they get the benefit of any valuable minerals, they can sell them and get benefit of that. So at the end of the day, what we want to do from a mineral and royalty owner perspective is make sure we reserve our rights to lithium, that we get paid a royalty on the production of lithium, when it's extracted, because what's happening here is similar to what is happening in Arkansas, where in the Smackover Formation, they're drilling wells. In the produced water, there's lithium, and then there's, some gas potentially or some oil as well. But they're taking advantage of that water stream and extracting the lithium and getting a benefit from that. And it sounds like the same thing is happening in Pennsylvania. And I would think that there are probably other locations across the U.S. where there is a high enough quantity of lithium in the produced water that it would make sense to do something about it. In other words, put the money and the investment in to extract and sell it. So really interesting report. And it's an area that we had not really heard of in the past about being a big focus for lithium extraction. So that was looking like that might change.
You said it, man. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what joint ventures come out of this area with some of the operators there to really get this technology and infrastructure set up. Because, if the oil and gas industry is good at anything, they're pretty good at partnering. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of great minds put to work on this.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Justin, do you want to talk about the rig count?
Let's do it. So down 2 units from last week net, and looks like just some shifting around, Matt. Interesting to see that Texas is down 3 units. Looks like one of those is in the Permian and maybe one other in the Eagle Ford here. But overall, just looks like a bit of shifting around. I was surprised that there was a unit added in California and a unit added in Louisiana. Those are, I would assume, pretty natural gas rich plays.
Yeah, Louisiana for sure. California actually has a fair amount of oil, and I'm surprised that there's any drilling going on there with the environmental regulations there and the state kind of going out against permitting new wells. Those must be existing permits that were issued prior to that moratorium or the ban on oil and gas. And so, yeah, I would say they're probably trying to drill out all of those permits that they already have before they expire. So that's probably why you see that uptick there. To your point earlier, I think it's interesting to see that Texas dropped 3 rigs. Interesting, North Dakota added 2, so they're up to 30. But yeah, just like you said, shuffling around, but we are seeing a steady decline week over week in general. We're down to 588 total across the United States, down almost 100 from a year ago. So we were at 682 a year ago. And that seems to be a continued trend of declining drilling, which I think supports that article we talked about earlier around the peak in production. So in order to maintain production, we need to continue to drill new wells. So despite the fact that we have 588 rigs running, doesn't mean that we're growing production. It means that we need that many rigs to basically just maintain production where it's at. So if this trend continues, then I would expect declining production just because we're not drilling enough wells to replace what the normal decline is of these new wells.
You said it, Matt. Yeah, interesting to see, and we'll continue to see how it kind of goes, and if that article comes to fruition, or if we start to see more of a drop as prices go down. It'll be interesting to see, but the numbers will tell.
Yeah, the numbers will definitely tell the tale. And so stay tuned for an update on this stuff. We'll definitely pay close attention to this recent endangered species decision in southeastern New Mexico and West Texas, because that is the epicenter of oil and gas activity in the United States. We have more than half of the rigs running across the country in that particular area. And if this blocks oil and gas development, we could see a big impact on the rig count and then also a big impact on production. So let's hope that's not the case, but we'll keep you posted. So thanks again, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.